Tonight, we are so pleased to bring activist, author, award-winning newspaper columnist, local treasure, I said, great friend, and a pretty good neighbor to me. These are just a few things we call Cheri Rae, because as you all know, she's done so much. She's championed many causes, like helping parents who have children with dyslexia. She's hosted Walk Santa Barbara events with her husband, John. She's a historian. And again, she's a wonderful writer. She's great at baseball, if you didn't know that. So baseball, little known fact. She's also good at cycling, of all things, because she wrote for Bicycling Magazine and Rodale Press. Am I right?
I did.
All right. But she's best known as an author and somebody who I think follows in the philosophical footsteps of Pearl Chase. So we're pleased to have her on hand to talk about String of Pearls. Please welcome Cheri Rae. Got a nice little turnout here, huh?
Yeah, very nice. Thank you. Fans of Pearl. Yeah.
So I have a few questions, then I'll turn it over to you for a solo talk. But like 10 years ago, you wrote The Little Guide.
Right.
What prompted you to want to expand more?
Well, I never thought that I was going to do that, but when I did The Little Guide, I always thought that some real biographer was going to do a real book about her, and that maybe that would persuade someone to do it, and nobody did. And so I just started thinking about her more and more, and it just sort of touched me that she didn't have a real book.
Yeah.
That little book wasn't enough. And so,
Agreed.
you know, I just sort of started thinking about it and then decided to do it. Yeah.
Well, you are that biographer.
Apparently I am. Maybe she chose me. I mean, I kind of wonder sometimes because it was just this idea that just wouldn't go away.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and I really wanted to tell the story more about the woman, not just the icon.
Yes.
You know, we always think of her as an old, maybe a little bit grumpy old lady who got away, and that wasn't always her. And that's why the cover. Yeah, that's why this beautiful cover, because, you know, like all of us, she was once young, you know, she wasn't always young. So,
that's all we knew about, though. As Mari, our owner, said before, that you only saw her as an older woman. And
right.
It's so neat that and I have to ask where you were able to find this cover photo.
I think that it was her high school yearbook photo. I actually found it at the Presidio Research Center a couple of years ago, and the minute I saw it, I was like, that's the image. And I had one editor who wasn't happy with that image at all and wanted it to be completely different. And I'm like, no, this is this photo. And you know, the look in her eyes, there's just such a wise look for such a young woman. Mm-hmm. It just really touched me. So yeah.
You're a kindred spirit with her in terms of wanting to preserve, and I'm just wondering the connect you felt when you were researching not only this book, but you know, the little guide as well. You seem to have this really big connection with your subject, which is kind of a rare thing for authors profiling. Yeah. So if you could talk a little bit about your connection with Pearl Chase.
The first book, I did it because I was doing work for the Pearl Chase Society, and they asked me to do their newsletter. So every month I would go and to a meeting of the board, and I would hear people asking for donations and for grants. And the Pearl Chase Society is very generous in giving all these grants. But I thought, these people don't know anything about this woman, and that seems important that they should. And so that's what was the motivating factor for the little book. For the larger book, I went out to UCSB to just sort of take a look at what was happening. And when I did the first book 10 years ago, it was her papers, which are massive, were not as well cataloged as they are now. And there were some other items, for example, her scrapbook from when she was in college, that became available. And just a lot of information was available that was more accessible to me. So that's part of why I just got on it. And then the pandemic happened, and it was like, well, I'm committed now. And so I spent 2 years on the online researching a lot of Santa Barbara and a lot of Pearl Chase, and I got pretty deep, maybe too much into Santa Barbara, because then I had to pare away a lot of the Santa Barbara history to focus more on her.
Wow, remarkable woman. I mean, everybody knows, pretty much everybody knows about Chase Palm Park, Morton Bay, Fig Tree. But you had mentioned UCSB earlier. I did not know about UCSB and her connection of transforming it from Santa Barbara Teachers College into convincing the UC system.
Education was everything to her. It was her cornerstone of her life. And you know, she went to UC Berkeley, and when she came back and had graduated, she really wanted to transform Santa Barbara, and she wanted a college to provide the opportunity that she had far away. And so she just started working, and they had this state normal college, which was for teachers, and she actually went there and got her teaching credential there. And then she just kept working on making started out as a state college and then turned into the university. She was the driving force behind it. And and so then when she was getting ready to, you know, retire from regular life, she donated all of her papers, all of her professional papers, as well as her personal ones. And that was what intrigued me. So I had several subject areas to go into, but I really wanted to know more about her. So after the pandemic was over, I made the commitment to go through her entire personal correspondence, and she kept all of it. I mean, there were even like bills from getting her hair done. I mean, you know, it was amazing. And, you know, and so it's pretty wonderful that she did that. And then there were times, I have to say, that I wondered, you know, it's her privacy. I started thinking about her privacy, and was I telling too much? Was I finding too much? But then I talked to a few people about this, and it was basically like, well, she donated the materials. So what she gave that, somebody was going to find it someday. And you have to think that she was conscious of that. Yeah. And she was, because there were a few letters that I found, some love letters that were scratched out, and a couple that were cut. And so and I really wish I could have known what those said. You know? But then, you know, you got to have respect for her. And she did donate. And what really intrigued me about the personal work was I knew that I was, since the last person had cataloged the material, nobody had seen it. It was pristine. So that's why I felt really that it was important to tell some of the stories. So that's how I came up with this idea of the string of pearls, which each pearl is a story. Yeah, that kind of strings together.
That's really interesting. Yeah. How much research are we talking about in terms of volume of paperwork, and did you sift through it?
You know, the really amazing thing is I probably only touched 10% of what she has out there. There are a couple of things. World War I never could find the file on World War I. They don't know where it is at UCSB, so that was a problem. And there was something I really wanted to find about that. Couldn't find it. What I did was I went to subject areas that I knew about: plans and planting, Better Homes in America, all the things that I knew she had done, and then it was fleshed out more with the personal correspondence.
Interesting. It was colored in then. I mean, the personal correspondence, it's really added the color.
It added the whole story of her as a woman. I mean, I could not. I didn't want to just hit the high points of, oh, she got this award and she did that. And everybody knows that. Well, no, everybody doesn't know that. My poor husband, every time I would come back from UCSB, I'd be so excited, and I'd be going through all the materials, and I was always saying, nobody knows this. And he'd go, I know. And so he knows everything. Well, he doesn't know everything, but he knows a lot more than most people. So my job, I felt, was to tell those stories that nobody knows about.
That's what makes it wonderful. Yeah. If you can, all right, I'm gonna let you take it away here and share what you would like to share with us.
Well, I have. There's a passage in here that I'd really like to start with. To me, it's that I want to give context to the defining comment that she made. Everybody has heard the comment that she made, but I want to provide perhaps what was behind it. And so this was from 1907. She was a college junior, and she went back and forth on the train from Santa Barbara to Berkeley. And it begins, when Pearl once again boarded the train south for Santa Barbara for the holiday break, she surely compared San Francisco and Santa Barbara. So this would be right after the earthquake, a year after. She wrote in her diary that she frequently visited the city across the bay from Berkeley, and exactly 1 year to the date after the San Francisco earthquake, she had attended a ball at the newly rebuilt Fairmont Hotel. She kept the invitation to the gala event in her scrapbook. The iconic hotel had been severely damaged by the disaster. Its quick reconstruction was a point of pride in the city, proof that it would rise from the ashes. The work had been designed and overseen by architect Julia Morgan. And Pearl would go on to work with Julia later. Pearl's interest in architecture had been sparked in part by the efforts of the citizens of San Francisco to reclaim their beautiful city. She had attended an exhibition of the Architectural Association in Berkeley and was inspired by the idea that the built environment can complement the natural environment. It's likely that Pearl wondered what it would take for Santa Barbara to make similar improvements. Although the Bay Area offered a life of the mind and other cosmopolitan attractions, she loved the open spaces, coastal access, and social scene of Santa Barbara. The small town had become her home, even though the built environment and cultural life did not match its extraordinary natural setting. Not yet, anyway. But with vision, persistence, and determination, along with the resilience seen in San Francisco, perhaps it could. By the time the train pulled into Santa Barbara, Pearl gathered her belongings and prepared to greet her family. She never forgot the feeling that she had then, as she described to a reporter for the Santa Barbara News Press in 1968. I remember alighting from the train at the old Victoria Station, coming home for the holiday, and how ashamed I was of Santa Barbara's shabby buildings, dusty streets, and lack of landscaping. Then and there, I resolved to make Santa Barbara a more beautiful place to live in.
Wow.
It was a defining moment in the life of an 18-year-old college junior. It was a vision of the future, her own and that of her adopted hometown.
Wow. So young.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I think that, that's the quote that most people have heard about.
Yeah.
Oh, she got off the train. But I like that there was a context for it. She'd been through the San Francisco earthquake. She witnessed a rejuvenation of the city so quickly, and I think the Julia Morgan connection was really important. It was a woman. It was a woman who she knew her already because they were in the same, they called it a fraternity in those days.
Yeah.
They were in the same fraternity. And then they worked together here in Santa Barbara.
I was going to ask,
Yeah.
so that how did those two work together then? in Santa Barbara?
It's crazy. Julia Morgan was actually here on the day of the earthquake in 1925.
25, yeah.
And she and Pearl were working on the Margaret Baylor Inn. And that was, they worked together on that. Pearl was not a fan of Hearst Castle, though. She said that most castles are fortified buildings.
From there.
I'm sorry.
Ouch. I said, ouch, I'm the former curator from there.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. She didn't like bungalows either, and I live in a bungalow. No, I try not to be like worshipful about her, so there's like little things about her. Yeah.
She had certain tastes and she had certain style as well. And if you could speak to her, her aesthetic appreciation.
Well, she was born in Boston and moved here when she was 11. And then they lived here for a short time and then moved to Denver. Denver was a big booming city at the time. So she spent 1 year of high school in Denver. And then, she came back to Santa Barbara and then up to the Bay Area. So she had sort of a big city aesthetic. And she had the opportunity with so many wealthy people moving to Santa Barbara or having winter homes in Santa Barbara that she could work with them on creating this beautiful place. And of course the earthquake, and I'm sorry that it was, it's sad that there was an earthquake and people died in it, but it kind of cleared the way for this new look, old look of Santa Barbara to grab onto the historic look, and which was so very different from back east or even from Denver or anything. It was just so unique. So that was part of it. But I also think personally, there's a real aesthetic that she had. She had beautiful jewelry, and she was always elegantly dressed. And even on this cover, she's wearing she's wearing pearls, and she's got some beautiful blouse. I've seen other photos of the top, and you know, everything was just elegant, and she was quite proper, and she did have that Puritan sort of background, you know, very Yankee sensibility that came from Boston. Yeah.
With Santa Barbara style.
Santa Barbara style, definitely. Yes, yeah, yes. Well, you know, we could talk a little bit with housing, because housing and style kind of go together. And she was very much about living in connection with nature and having the small house movement and all that. I'm going to read you one of her quotes. My husband said I shouldn't read many of her quotes, I should just read my quotes, but I think this is important, what she said. Several people have been interested in a project to provide a number of small, desirable cottages near the center of the city where people work, but the difficulty of building under present high prices has kept them from going ahead with the improvement. Pearl stated this in the Morning Press. The article was titled, "Housing Conditions Are Not as Ideal as Citizens Generally Believe." The year was 1920.
Oh.
Yeah.
More than 100 years ago, she's making a statement about today.
Exactly. She was a fortune teller, wasn't she? Wow. And she always would discourage people from moving to Santa Barbara. Oh. She said, for example, "Houses, particularly small ones, are still very rare. We are indeed sorry that aside from hotels and occasional apartments, we are so unhappily fixed for welcoming distinguished home seekers." Huh. And she was, I'll just read this one, a little other place that she talked about wanting people to appreciate Santa Barbara when they came here. And she said, "We tried to encourage people as they come so that they appreciate the environment, like not only the climate, but the appearance of the private homes, the commercial buildings, and the gardens." She was not a fan of what she called multiple family dwellings like apartments. In her opinion, as she expressed, they are probably the least creditable, the least adapted to modern use. But she acknowledged, "I'm afraid they're the form of the future. They are not very well built, and few of them are very well designed." She worried that poor design and construction would negatively affect what she called the experience of living in Santa Barbara.
Wow.
So she had a lot to say about housing, and she did a great deal of work on a national program called Better Homes of America. Yeah. And she worked with Herbert Hoover, and she was quite well known across the country. And Santa Barbara won these national awards year after year after year. So she really helped put Santa Barbara on the map with a small home movement. And she really wanted housing available to the middle class. You know, that was what a novel concept, right?
We're still working on that
We're
one.
still working on it.
But what did she say about State Street?
Somebody asked me that the other day, and you know, the thing is, she was very conscious that State Street was the commercial district of Santa Barbara, and it was very important that it be healthy for residents and for tourists. And she was very much about keeping Santa Barbara beautiful for residents and tourists, because that was the engine that drove the city. She was quite aware of that. But, you know, I don't ever want to say, oh, well, what would Pearl do, and then speak to it. But I don't think she'd be very happy right now. And she was also quite accident prone. And I have a feeling that if she was walking down State Street, she would have gotten into an accident at some point. So she would have probably gotten rid of all the bikes and all the electric bikes and everything else.
Her car had dents in it.
Yeah, she was always, yeah. This is Miss Days, Mary Louise Days. You worked with her. Yes.
Wow.
Yes. Wow. But you know, one of the interesting things I think, though, is that I've asked you about many personal parts of her life that she'd never shared.
No, a little bit about the one that I remember in the elevator at City Hall. She said she did not have a middle name because her grandfather thought Pearl Chase was fine because she would be married, and so she would be Pearl Chase, whatever.
She would always be a Chase.
Yeah, she looked at me, I'm single, you know.
Oh.
Well, and she was, because we talked about these various romances that she had, which are pretty well documented. I'd say that I found a stack of, if I were to stack them, about that high of love letters that were sent from her suitors, and she clearly sent them back. She sent them correspondence as well. And you know, I thought that was fascinating to both to discover and then also to know that she wasn't sharing it with, you were pretty close with her. So, and I don't know anybody else who knew her who's been able to say, oh yeah, I heard about that one. But one of the really interesting romances was with a gentleman who ended up going to World War I, and it was very sad because I think he was probably the love of her life, and it actually could have worked. She had sort of dedicated her life to her father once her mother died, but this guy was from Ohio, but it could have worked. He was willing to move to California, but sadly he went to France, and he was in an accident in the after the war was over. He was shot down, and he was a bombardier, and he had clearly what today we call PTSD. He was not the same person when he came back. So it was really very sad and tragic. And yeah.
You spoke about matters of the heart with her, but you also talked a little bit about her heart and what she had done for, like, people less fortunate, like things through the Council of Christmas Cheer, which is now the Unity Shop. And if you could speak a little bit about her charitable and her heart and what she's done for communities, not just for the aesthetic of Santa Barbara, but for the people themselves.
You know, after she taught for a few years, she really was more interested in social work. And so she went back to, took a lot of classes and became a social worker and worked at the recreation center. And that was the central hub of Santa Barbara and services there. She taught Americanization classes. She taught, in fact, she went back to her her roots of being a home economics teacher and was teaching cooking and all kinds of different classes that she was teaching. And she did have a very generous heart, and the holidays were really important to her, that people not spend them alone. And so she would invite people who were in like nursing homes, military people, anyone who didn't have a place to go to come to the recreation center. And they had a big open house at Christmas time. And she arranged, even like I was like 1914, the Christmas tree. It wasn't the one that we have now, but she did get that one started as well. But she had, you know, decorating the regular holiday Christmas tree. It was really important to her, and I remember that she mentioned one time that she hadn't had a Christmas with her family in decades because she was really generous in providing for the community, and she was very quiet about it. And something else that she did, which was pretty unsung and I found very touching, was I mentioned that education was so important to her. She arranged for 27 scholarships of extended family members, and she had she just established these for her like cousins and extended family, and she provided these, and she didn't even know these people. She didn't know these young people, but it was really sweet to read some of their thank you letters, like, you know, you sent me this, you know, they all got $2,000. You sent me this check, and it's so amazing, and it's like, it's really sweet. Some of them are all, you know, from the 70s, and they're all like tie-dye, and they're all like, you know, it's really cool. And so I thought that was, you know, she really wanted to pass something along, and yeah, I thought that was a real indicator. And then there were there's a chapter in here about the Russian ladies, and she heard about these two women and a little girl who had escaped the Bolshevik revolution and ended up in Italy, in Milan. And she managed to provide, she got funding for them. She was sending them National Geographic subscriptions and fruit and nuts, and, you know, she sort of adopted them. And, you know, it was, really she did a lot of quiet, like person-to-person work.
I'm sure we have some questions, but I'm going to ask you a couple more things, and then we'll open it up. You know, what else would you like to share from your book, without revealing too much, because we want people to buy the book?
I think that one of the things that's not well known about her is her conservation work, and she was friends with with a number of people. Two of the National Park Service directors were classmates of hers. And she had a friend named Harlene James who worked for the National American Civic and Planning Association. And I'll just give you an idea of the agenda, or the trips that they were taking. Pearl and Harlene shared many interests, including housing and planning, as well as roadside beauty and conservation. It was their shared enthusiasm for the natural world and for the exploration of state and national parks that inspired them to drive the nation's back roads together. The two meticulous planners plotted out long road trips to the crown jewels of the American outdoors as early as 1933. At the time, the Civilian Conservation Corps was busy building trails and infrastructure in the national parks as part of the New Deal. During a motor tour of the desert Southwest, Pearl and James viewed the striking pinnacles of Bryce, the Red Rock Canyon of Zion, the north rim of the Grand Canyon, and the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde. They also spent time in the New Mexico towns of Gallup and Santa Fe. A decade later, they took an even longer journey through state and national parks after attending the 1943 National Conference on Planning in Washington, D.C. Although gas rationing was instituted because of World War II, they motored out of the nation's capital and headed into the heart of the American West. They traveled to Mount Rushmore in the Black Hills of South Dakota, which had been dedicated just 2 years earlier. They toured the colorful geological formations in the Badlands. Continuing west, they visited Custer State Park, then drove on to Wyoming for adventures in Grand Teton and Yellowstone National Parks.
Wow.
1943, two women.
Yeah.
She loved to drive. She was always driving. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. How did you find that information? I'm just curious.
I went through the correspondence, and I
Yeah.
found correspondence between her and Harlene, and I just wrote it. I started writing the stories, and it's funny the way that I wrote the book. I was always a magazine writer, and I've written many essays and editorials and columns and that sort of thing. So I'm not someone who writes a long narrative of a 300-page book. So the way that I found that I could do it was take one subject at a time, and I think it works. And what I've heard from people who've read the book is that it's really fun to pick it up and put it down. You can read a chapter. They're all related, and they're in fairly well chronological order, but they each can stand on their own as well.
Interesting. As writers, we've talked about, you and I have talked about short form, long form, but to put together a nonfiction piece of work, to be able to string and weave everything together, I mean, you did a wonderful job, and I was wondering how much of a challenge that was for you to do that, as you were talking about short form journalism and doing to this book. I'm sure
it was really hard. It took me a long time. I worked with one editor who just wanted me to sort of make it a historical fiction kind of thing. I'm like, no, I'm not doing that. There's enough stories about her. I want it to be the real thing. It took me, probably figuring out how to organize it took me a year. It just did.
Okay.
And I have the copies of the drafts, to show for it. But once I hit on the pearls as a metaphor, it really kind of pulled it all together, and that worked. It worked for me.
That's really interesting. Would you like to share one more before we open it
I
up?
would. I'll do one little sort of wrap up of her. Pearl lived from the administration of Grover Cleveland to that of Jimmy Carter. She worked closely with Herbert Hoover and was invited to the inauguration of Richard Nixon. She was a junior in high school when the Wright brothers took their first flight, and a busy 80-year-old community activist when the first astronauts walked on the moon. She responded to moments of crisis as opportunities for action, transforming the city's architecture after the earthquake in 1925 and responding to the 1969 oil spill by helping initiate the modern environmental movement. Through her visionary leadership, force of will, and ability to seize the moment, Pearl helped guide Santa Barbara's development from a dusty town that embarrassed her to a sophisticated center of unique architecture, arts and culture, and community pride. She cared about the natural environment as much as the built one, and always remembered that it was people she cared about most.
Wow. That was beautiful.
Thank you.
Let's open it up.
Anybody have any questions?
Well, I'll start.
All right, Rich.
In a city that is so self-aware, self-reflective, it's surprising that no one else has really delved into this the way you have until now.
I know, isn't it? I know.
Do you have any thoughts about why that is the case?
I don't know who would have done it. Walker Tompkins wasn't particularly interested in her. I mean, he wrote, he called her the greatest woman of the century, but he didn't capture her. And I don't know. I really don't. And I guess that's why I ended up doing it myself. And one of the reasons I did it was we went to a show that was up in Sacramento. It was supposed to be a wonderful show. It was curated by Maria Shriver about the women of California. And I was like so excited. I'm like, well, Pearl Chase has got to be here. And the first part of the exhibit was the girls from Juicy Couture. And I'm like, what? No. And there was nothing, not one thing about Pearl Chase. So that kind of bothered me. And I thought, well, she was much better known many years ago in Sacramento and in the Bay Area and that sort of thing. But I didn't want her to be forgotten. And I guess that's why I did it.
Thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
Wow.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for all your good work. Yeah. Anybody else?
Any other questions?
Yeah.
I wonder about her relations with other people who would have been her peers. So other women, particularly affluent women, what kind of recruitment was done in what kind of way?
She was, because she was young in Santa Barbara, and so many of the wealthy people moved here. She was already established. So while she wasn't wealthy, she did have the connections. And her father, because he was in the real estate business, he basically started real estate in Santa Barbara. He had great connections as well. So yeah, she was close to everyone who was a mover and shaker. They all knew each other. And in the 40s, she actually started something called the Scorpio Club, which was a social club for women who were born under the Scorpio sign only. And Miss Daisy, you missed it by how many days?
About a month.
Oh, a whole month.
I was
You couldn't be
flattered
in
that
it.
she invited me.
She invited you, but she wouldn't let you in. Yeah.
Oh.
And so they only met once
I
a year.
didn't really know what it was.
Oh. So they met once a year
She
to talk
had a
about.
way of telephoning any woman that she knew, especially women. The men she gave orders to, but the women, she said, I need volunteers, I need to do this, this, and this, and you did it. But it wasn't always happy because sometimes she would give the same instructions to several people, and then you'd find out, oh, it's already been done. You couldn't say no.
Well, one way or another, she got it taken care of. Yeah.
Cheri, why do you think she could accomplish so much without seeking political office?
In the 30s, the community wanted her to run for office, and she was unequivocal, no, she is never going to run. And she liked it that way because she, I think, had a lot more power than someone in political office, because as she said, that the politicians come and go, but the people with their organizations, they stay. And so that's what she wanted. She wanted politicians to remember that, but she also wanted community members to remember that we have a responsibility to speak to them. And to she said, the elected officials need to remember that they need to hear from people. So, yeah, she was not interested in political. I would have clipped her wings too much. I mean, she was, she had an independence that was unlike anybody in an elected office. So, yeah.
Isn't that something about our city, though? As a lifelong resident, there are people out there who you wish were in office, like Pearl Chase. And I could see two people in this room that I wish would run for office. But, well, I'm not going to mention Rich Applebaum's name or anything like that. But.
Yeah, I should have done that a long time ago.
But I will take contributions.
Oh, now you sound like a politician.
Let's get one more question. Does anybody have something or? Yeah.
Somewhere, probably when I toured houses at the Pearl Chase Society, someone told me that she had been interviewed as an older woman, and the young woman who was interviewing her called her Pearl. And she said to the young woman, or so the story went, that people who know me call me Miss Chase. And so I just wondered if that was apocryphal or...
I think that may have been, in 1940, Reader's Digest did a big story about her. And in those days, that was the biggest magazine in the world. And she was quite miffed because they called her Santa Barbara's Pearl. She did not like that at all. So, yeah, I think that that's probably the case. She was, she was a lady, and she was more formal, and she probably wouldn't have liked, she would have been Miss Chase. Yeah.
Cheri Rae, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you.